All right, so we're now going to move on to our next unit, and that is going to be section 5C, and that's going to be inequalities. So you guys just filled out a pre-assessment, and although some of you did really well, there was still a large amount of people who seemed to struggle with inequalities in general and knowing how to read them, graph them, and solve them. I was expecting there to be some issues with solving inequalities because I didn't think that you guys would have done that before, but I was hoping that maybe you can make some connections between equations and inequalities. But since there was some lack of understanding by enough people, I am going to have to go through and start from the beginning with inequalities, which is perfectly fine. But just know that this video might be broken up into two separate videos. All right, so I'm going to try and keep this video at a reasonable length, so that way it doesn't seem too long or too much. But we'll see how long it is, and from there we'll then decide if we're going to break this up in the two videos or not. All right, so let's go ahead and get into our learning objectives. So the first thing is you're going to have to know the difference between an inequality and an equation. Well, you should already know equations very in detail, and that's where we have the equal sign. So we could say x is equal to 3. That was an equation that we had. An inequality is going to be using our less than or our greater than signs. So we would have seen inequality as x is less than 3. Right? So there's a huge difference between these two, an equation and an inequality. And it's very, very important that you know the difference between them. All right, we're going to get more into the inequalities and all the different symbols that you might see. But for right now, for this, you need to know the difference between an inequality and an equation. Then you'll have to know how to represent inequalities using different symbols. And what I mean by this is you're going to have to know what these different symbols mean. All right, you'll have to know what less than, what greater than, what less than or equal to, and what greater than or equal to. You'll have to be able to identify those different symbols and exactly what they mean. You'll have to know how to write inequalities. All right, so I just added this question here. So what I mean is when you're given a statement like a number is less than 5, you're going to have to know, well, this is going to be x is less than 5. All right, we're going to get into detail about this as how you'll know how to translate from that statement to your inequality, just like we learn how to translate from a statement to an equation. And then you're going to have to know how to graph your inequalities. So some people were sending me messages about, well, what was the difference when you had this colored in circle versus when you had the open circle? So what was the difference between those? And you're going to have to know how to graph your inequalities. So for instance, this is what maybe some of your graphs look like, but you're going to have to know how to graph inequalities. That may be on this video, it may be on the next one. All right, we're going to see exactly what we can get done in this video, but the solving inequalities is definitely going to be at least after this, depending on what we can get done in this video or not. All right, now there's several ways that you may have learned how to read these inequalities, and I'm going to go through two of the different ways with you here real quick. One of the first ways is that you see that it's opening up to one point, to one side, and then the other side it forms this point, and you see that here. So one of the ways you can remember is the side that it opens up, that is going to be our big number because it's opening up nice and wide. And then the side here where we get this point, that is going to be our smaller number because it's coming to and closing into a very small point. All right, so if we look at here, it's opening up. So this number or this side would represent our bigger side. And here where it comes and closes into the small, tiny little point, that is going to be our smaller side. All right, so that's one way that you can think about this as to know exactly which side it is opening up to. I'm going to also talk about the alligator mouth that you guys probably would have seen before. Now, there's one other thing that we're going to add to this, and that is exactly how do we read these? And just like we read a book, we read this from left to right. So I'm going to erase this instead of saying big and small. I'm going to erase this really quick. I'm going to write two different numbers. So if I write this number here, let's say 3 and let's say 5. All right, 5 is greater than 3, and that's why it is opening up to the bigger side here. Right, it's opening up to this bigger number, and here where we come to the small little point, that is going to be our smaller number. And the way that we would read this is we start from the left. We would say 3 is less than 5. All right, and then when I go ahead and add these numbers here, if I were to write this exact same statement out, I would have to write my 5 on the left-hand side because once again, 5 is greater than 3. So therefore the bigger side is opening up to where our 5 is. And then our point, the small little point, is where our smaller number would be. And the way that we would read this is 5 is greater than 3. So these two statements are saying the exact same thing. 3 is less than 5, and 5 is greater than 3. It's just depending on how our inequality symbol is opening. If it's opening to the left, to the right, it depends on how we're going to actually read this. But we read these left to right. So this would be read 3 is less than 5, while this one would be read 5 is greater than 3, because we're starting with our larger number here first, and in this one we're starting with our smaller number. All right, now the other way you might have seen this before is that we treat these inequality signs like our alligators. And if you think in the wild, if an alligator is looking at two different animals that it wants to eat, it's going to go after the bigger animal because it wants to get that more food. Yeah, maybe the smaller animal might be easier for it to take down, but it's going to want to eat more. All right, maybe it's not necessarily thinking about which animal it's going to attack, but what would it rather eat, the bigger or the smaller animal? So they want to eat more. So one of the ways in that we can do this is when we have these numbers, if I'm trying to write an inequality between 8 and 10, well, I'm going to then choose the one where it's opening up towards the bigger number because 10 is greater than 8. So remember, we would read these left to right. So we would read this as 8 is less than 10. All right, and then for this one here, they're both negative. Remember, the closer you are to 0 on the number line, the greater you are when you're in a negative. So even though that this 10 you may think is greater than, since negative 3 is to the right of negative 10 on our number line, we know that negative 3 is greater than. So we would then have this alligator mouth opening up towards that negative 3. And once again, we read this from left to right. So we would say negative 3 is greater than negative 10. All right, so it's very important that you guys understand this aspect of how you read these and where these inequalities are opening up to. Like I said, a lot of you did do really well, but there were a pretty high percentage that still seemed to struggle with this part of it. All right, so let's just talk about an inequality real quick for a little bit. So it says an inequality is a mathematical sentence that compares quantities. An inequality like x is less than 5 or x is greater than 7 can be written to express how a variable compares to another number or a set of numbers. All right, so these are the different inequality symbols that you're going to see. Now, if you notice, two of these, let's say number 1 or these two here, they're very similar, whereas these two are also similar but different than the other ones. So we're going to have to identify and say, well, wait a minute. These two I'm about to highlight are almost identical. There's one major difference between them. This one has a line underneath. What does that mean? All right, so when we are doing these first two and there's no line, remember, we read this left to right. So since the smaller side is to the left, this is read as less than, because whatever number we would have here, 1 would be less than 3. So remember, since we read this left to right, when it's opening up to the right-hand side like that, we would say less than. In this case, if we were to fill in numbers here, we could write 3 is greater than 1. So this is represented as greater than. All right, so it's important that you are reading these left to right. And if you're unsure, fill in numbers. Know that it's opening up to the greater number. Fill in numbers, ones that are less than or greater than each other, and see how you would read that statement. All right, this one would be read that 1 is less than 3, therefore we would read this statement as less than. This one would be read that 3 is greater than 1, therefore we would read this statement as greater than. All right, now, what does it mean when we have these lines underneath? Well, if you think about it, it's really close to an equation. An equation are two lines. This, we have one line underneath. So all this is telling us is that it is not only just less than, but it can also be equal to. So once again, we can say less than or equal to. All right, so when we have the line underneath of it, that is just telling us that not only would it be less than, but it also can be equal to it as well. And then this one, since it's opening up to the left-hand side, if we were to fill in numbers, 3 would be greater than 1, we would say greater than or equal to. All right, so it's really, really important that you understand these symbols. And like I said, I know some of you, this is really redundant and you probably don't need to see this video, but it is work that you're going to have to do. Maybe and some people did need to see this again. All right, so let's just go ahead and fill this in. if it's an equation, if we want to make this as a statement, well, what number is equal to 8? Well, that will be 8. 8 is equal to 8. There's only one case that can happen. If I wrote any other number that we know that exists, it won't be equal to 8. The only number that is equal to 8 is 8. So in this case, there's one possible solution. Right? In this case, we have 3 plus 2 is equal to 5. Or I'm sorry, what plus 2 is equal to 5? Well, we were solving equations already, so we know that we can subtract this 2 on this both sides, and we can say, okay, well, that would have to be equal to 3. So once again, this is the only possible solution that we can have. 3 is the only answer. If I plug in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 0, any negative number, it's not going to be equal to 5. There's one possible solution when we have an equation. That is it. With inequalities, if I ask you to fill out a number that is less than 8, I can ask every single one of you in your grade 6 class, and every single one of you can give me a different value that is less than 8. Right? We can write 0, we can write 1, 2, 3, etc., all the way up until 7. I can't write 8 though, because 8 is not less than 8. 8 is equal to 8, so it wouldn't satisfy this because it's just less than. And I can write any negative number. So you see that there are multiple solutions that we can have for this. It's not just going to be one anymore. There's going to be many solutions or a set of solutions. All right. And then for this one here, if we want to know what plus 2 is going to be greater than 5, well, I know 3 plus 2 is equal to 5. So if I need it to be greater than 5, that means I need this number to be greater than 3. So 4 plus 2 is 6. We know that will work. 5 plus 2 is 7. We know that will work. And any other number I pick that's greater than 5, it's automatically going to be greater than 5 when we add 2 to it, because 7 already starts out as greater than 5. So any of these numbers could work. So once again, I can ask all of you, give me a number that will satisfy this inequality, and all of you can give me a different number. All right? So one of the things that you have to understand is equations will have one solution, where inequalities can have many solutions. All right? Because there are a ton of different numbers. There's actually infinitely many numbers in this case that we can substitute in that will allow for us to add 2 to it and be greater than 5. Right? So inequalities actually give us an infinite amount of solutions. And even if we'll talk about this in further detail, and you'll talk about this in further detail as well in your years to come. But you'll see that when we're dealing with equations, we only have one solution. And when we're dealing with inequalities, there are many solutions that we have. Right? We're just going to pause here in this video. It's already been a too long a video than what I wanted. So this video is going to be broken up into separate days. But let's go back to our learning objectives. All right, so what you should be able to know now from this video, hopefully, if you didn't know already, is the difference between an inequality and an equation. All right, what is the difference? Well, we know inequality, we have many solutions, and equation, we have one. And then you also should know how to represent inequalities using different symbols. Now, you should have seen this before. This shouldn't be new right now. So you should know less than or equal to, greater than, and greater than or equal to. Right? You should know these symbols, and hopefully after refreshing your memory now, they make a little bit more sense to you. We will pick up on these two topics in our next video. All right, so that is it.